Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Jayne, Senior Policy Counsel at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. This week we're taking a look at some of the most alarming executive orders that President Donald Trump has signed so far in his second term. Joining me in studio for a nice change is our Government Affairs Director, Mark Dann, who's usually in D.C. Nice to see you, Mark.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's great to be in Madison.
So, as always, we want to hear your thoughts on the topics we discussed today. Please leave your questions in the chat below or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer your questions live during the show. Now, since Donald Trump took the oath of office for the second time on January 20th, he has signed more than 50 executive orders as of the time of this recording. They cover a range of issues, including trade, immigration, foreign aid, diversity, civil rights, and much more. And Trump made quite a spectacle out of signing his first round of executive orders.
Well, yes, that's right. During a presidential inauguration parade, after he was sworn in, Trump signed his first executive orders in front of a crowd of cheering supporters. So here's a clip from that unusual moment.
The first item that President Trump is signing is the rescission of 78 Biden-era executive actions, executive orders, presidential memoranda, and others.
Could you imagine Biden doing this? I don't think so.
The next item here is the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Treaty.
Okay, and apparently President Trump has some ups. Who knew? But and then Trump spoke this morning at the National Prayer Breakfast, where he announced a new executive order to target what he calls an anti-Christian bias. Take a look.
Today I'm signing an executive order to make our Attorney General, who's a great person, she's going to be a great Attorney General, Pam Bondi, the head of a task force, brand new, to eradicate anti-Christian bias. The mission of this task force will be to immediately halt all forms of anti-Christian targeting and discrimination within the federal government. In addition, the task force will work to fully prosecute anti-Christian violence and vandalism in our society and to move heaven and earth to defend the rights of Christians and religious believers nationwide. This week, I'm also creating the White House Faith Office, led by Pastor Paula White, who is so amazing.
All right, so we're going to talk about what all of that means, what some of the more problematic executive orders are. But before we get into the discussion, Mark, can you talk a little bit about what is an executive order, why are they important, and why should people care about them?
Yeah, sure thing. So basically, think of an executive order as it's a set of instructions. It's not an act of Congress, it's not the law, but it's basically saying, here's what I want the federal government to do. And a lot of times an executive order might sound innocuous, it might sound pretty boring, but not with this process. So it's basically Trump is instructing the federal government, here's what I want you to do. And a lot of times where it goes from here is that starting with Russ Vought from OMB, who unfortunately is probably going to be confirmed tonight, they're going to take a lot of these executive orders and they're going to tell to the departments to go start making rules and regulations. So as we'll get into with a lot of the specific executive orders, you're going to start seeing more rules and regulations, whether it's on religious freedom or accessing health care, that they're going to be writing a lot of new rules about, without so much as changing the law, but it's simply about how the laws are interpretive. And they are going to be pretty wide-ranging on all aspects of American life.
Absolutely. And so to make sure people understand, so we have our kind of 8th grade civics 3 branches of government, right? So we have the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and then the executive branch.
Yes.
So the president, as the head of the executive branch, has all these different agencies that you mentioned. So these include things like the Department of Education, the Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, and many, many more, right? And so these are, you're saying these executive orders are kind of marching orders for those agencies, right?
Correct. So they're not necessarily changing the law, it's how the laws are interpreted. And there's a fair amount of leeway with a lot of laws and saying, well, we're going to emphasize certain aspects of this law, we're going to downplay certain aspects of this. And again, this is what happens with Democratic administrations, Republican administrations. What's new is that definitely Trump is setting a big tone of he is taking executive action to go into his legislative priorities.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And we will talk later a little bit about what it is that can be done to combat this effort. But very broadly speaking, the process you're describing is what we would call the rulemaking process, right? So the executive orders come out, and then the agencies come out with proposed rules or proposed regulations. And just in general terms, what can be done at that stage? What does that process kind of look like, where groups like the FFRF Action Fund can weigh in and help to stop some of these efforts?
So the good news is that the rulemaking process is actually fairly open and fairly public. There's a website where people can see the rules and regulations when they're starting to be formulated. They're going to be able to see, and often times there's a comment process. Now, how much time the public is going to be weighing into that, I would expect under Vaught, who's going to be the director of the Office of Management and Budget, which manages a lot of these regulations, to be compressed. So that's something to watch for. But yes, the public is going to be able to weigh in on a lot of that. And then from a lot of the comments, the agency goes back, makes their rules, and then issues their final rules as well. But then you can take a lot of the rules and you can go into a potential court challenge with a lot of them as well. So yes, the public gets to weigh in, but you can also weigh in through the courts and through the court system as well. And I think a lot of our legal experts are going to be having a hand in saying how, I'm going to guess, with this administration, there's going to be a fair amount to disagree with on the separation of church and state. So I imagine our legal team is going to have a lot to say about a lot of the rules and regulations coming out.
Absolutely. And I think something we can expect is that, we've seen how this administration kind of floods the zone, right? They fill the air with so much to distract everybody that these regulations are the sort of thing that are so easy to miss, even though there is an opportunity for public comment. So how would you say the public has an opportunity to weigh in, how would you recommend people try to stay on top of that so they know when there's an opportunity?
So first thing I would say is watch the Trump distraction. So something is going to happen and Trump is going to do what he always does, is going to say something that is very big and very non-conventional, and everyone is just going to go, oh, look over there. And so first of all, don't do the Trump look over there was a good way to stay away from it. It's the stuff that comes through what's an executive order, where is a bureaucracy moving, all the stuff that's happening with Doge and Elon Musk. Those are real things. When he's just kind of blabbing at the top of his head, that's just a distraction. So stay away from the Trump distractions would be my first piece of advice. The second, good news, is that we're going to be doing a lot more on rules and regulations. So a lot of FFRF supporters, and so if you're not an FFRF supporter, please join us, are going to be able to weigh in on that. And we're going to be able to be working closely in ways where it's going to be easy to understand what the rule is, where it's going, how it impacts you, and what you can do to weigh in on it. And moreover, how a certain rule or regulation is going to impact your life. That's the best thing you can do, is talk about how does this matter to me? That's the best thing you can do. So I would say don't get distracted, and then stay tuned and sign up for FFRF alerts is a really good way to stay on top of these things and stay focused.
Awesome. All right, so we are going to dive into some of these executive orders. Can you touch briefly on where did these come from? I presume that Donald Trump did not just dream up all of these by himself.
No. Luckily, people going into his administration were very kind that they all wrote this down in Project 2025. So most of pretty much every single one of these executive orders are coming from Project 2025. You can see exactly where they're going. You know what's coming. So the good news with that is that as an organization, we're just really well prepared. We know what is coming in with religious freedom. Sadly, we know what's coming in that's going to really be awful for rights of the LGBTQ plus community. We know where they're going with the Department of Education. They did write that down. So none of this is a surprise. With that as well. And again, going back to Russ Vaught, who's going to be the head of the Office of Management and Budget, which manages a lot of the rules and regulations, he wrote a big chunk of Project 2025. So for folks who are thinking, well, are they moving in a Project 2025 direction? The answer is yes, they're 100%. The Trump administration is moving into Project 2025 direction, and all the people who said, oh, well, Trump disavowed Project 2025 and he has nothing to do with it. Well, if you believe that, there's some Trump steaks I'd like to sell you.
Right. Yeah, and we've seen this so far. We'll get into some of the specifics again, but it is unquestionable that this is the plan as we were calling it. This is what's going to happen.
Right.
This is what has happened so far.
And here we are.
And so, we've been talking about Project 2025 for quite a while, since we first saw it, basically. What would you say are some of the things that they are trying to show and accomplish through that plan? What are some of the consistent strategies going on in there?
I think you saw it in that clip, is that he was saying, look, I'm in charge. I'm sending action. He even said, can you imagine Biden doing this? And on that. And yes, Biden was extremely active with executive orders. He was setting a tone with all of that. But it's definitely moving forward that he is in charge. To borrow a phrase from Andrew Lloyd Webber, Perone is up and moving. And that is exactly where they're going. They're showing action. They're showing the fulfillment of campaign promises. They are going forward. And with a lot of them, they're going to move forward. They're going to wait for the judgment. They're not going to wait for the judgment of the courts. They're just saying, here we go. This is what we were elected on, and we're moving in this direction. And if you don't like it, tough nookie. So it's a very, it's clear where they're going.
Yeah, and we had flagged in the past that one of the scariest aspects of this is this consistent consolidation of power in the Oval Office, right? So it's sort of they're wanting to rewrite the rules so that anything that Trump and his inner circle want to do, they want to be empowered to do.
Right.
And then in terms of what are they going to do with that power? Well, one of the things that we saw that was a consistent message in Project 2025 was a message of Christian nationalism, which of course we've been sounding the alarm about for years now. But a lot of the people who are involved in this architecture of Project 2025 clearly come from that Christian nationalist, fringe extremist background. So that's one of the reasons that we are making such a big deal of it, and that we are going to be fighting so vigorously against it.
Absolutely. I mean, again, it's the Project 2025 Christian nationalist blueprint that you are starting to see. And plus, with in our discussions with members of Congress, is they're saying, like, wait a second, why are we ceding so much power to the president? We have constitutional authority over power of the purse. Well, why are we giving that power up? And I think that is something that you're going to be seeing that debate moving forward as well. If people in the Trump administration think they should be able to set appropriations and allocate money, and Congress doesn't have much. I've heard from lobbying circles in some offices is like, well, why are you coming and talking to us about appropriations when you could just be talking to the White House? And that's a really scary thing, is because most people getting an appointment with the White House, very hard. But if you are a constituency group or whatnot, getting an appointment with your member of Congress or your senator's office and being able to talk about your needs and what is important to you in the budget and appropriations process, that's an important detail. So I have no clue on why members of Congress are saying, okay, well, we think the president should handle that. It is a very, very bad idea of when the president is going to be the start and end of that conversation. And that cuts out a lot of folks. It's not democratic, and the appropriations process has there's problems with it, but on the whole, you definitely have, it's a much more open process than if power is just simply consolidated within the presidency.
Absolutely. And so that's very alarming, and all the more reason that we're going to have to stay very focused on what happens in the wake of these executive orders, and that we are keeping people informed, educated, active. So, all right, let's dive in.
All right, so let's highlight a few of the dozens of executive orders that President Trump has signed that are concerning for us at FFRF.
The first one that we're going to talk about that's on the screen is defending women from gender ideology, extremism, and restoring biological truth to the federal government. So obviously this is Trump's name for, he gets to decide what these are all called, so that's his title. But do you want to just comment, what's this one basically about?
Oh, this one's just straight up nonsense. So basically, this is just a friggin' joke. It's going up. It is harmful to the LGBTQ community. It's harmful to the transgender community. And it's also just harmful. So first, I mean, the whole thing is just ridiculous. Is President Trump comes in, was elected on prices of eggs. What the heck does this have to do with the price of eggs and things along those lines? And it goes into, and it's showing you this is where we think the priorities of the government are, not on lowering prices, but on this type of nonsense. And so you are seeing those attacks of this weird prioritization. It's not competition with China. It is not the war in Ukraine. Or the price of daily life. It's going after this nonsense. So you are seeing this, that a lot of them have to do with these types of things. So, and again, all of this was established in Project 2025. It's not being pulled out from the sky.
Yeah, and it's demagoguery, right? So we've seen this from a lot of Christian nationalists, and unfortunately from some others too, where they take these non-issues, things like trans athletes in K-12 sports, and they say, well, let's drop everything else and deal with this because this is an impending emergency. And like you said, it's absolute nonsense, and it's red meat to the base.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've seen is that with a lot of the anti-trans, a lot of that is that people say, well, what does this have to do with separation of church and state? Well, a couple weeks ago, you did see Speaker Johnson, after Congress weighed in on some of these issues, saying, well, the Bible says it's this and it's that. And so there's definitely a religious angle with a lot of these things. So those are the areas that obviously the whole thing should keep folks up at night, but it's simply using religion to move this hardcore right-wing agenda that should keep people up at night.
Absolutely. All right, so another one that we saw President Trump sign there is called the initial rescission of harmful executive orders and actions. So this is the one that he actually it's just silly that he signed it and said, would you see President Biden do that? It's like, no, of course, Biden's not going to rescind his own executive orders.
Yeah.
It's a silly thing to say. But what's going on with this? It's important to know this. In one sense, this is not super uncommon. When Biden came in, the first thing he did is cross out all the stuff that Trump did, all of his executive orders. And so this is kind of normal in one hand, where a new administration comes in, they undo a whole swath of executive orders from the prior administration. But one thing to highlight in particular that should be really alarming for people who care about religious liberty and state-church separation is there is a whole string of regulations that exist in a bunch of different agencies that provide protections for religious liberty for anyone who gets federal government support. So for example, if you go to a soup kitchen that receives federal dollars, there are rules that were first put in place by President Obama that said, if you are going to be offering this service, you cannot be coercing people into religious activity. You can't hold their sandwich hostage and say, well, you have to listen to this sermon first, right? So there were rules that were put into place that we supported at FFRF that said you have to, if you're a religious entity getting federal dollars to provide a social service, you have to alert any beneficiaries of that service that they have these religious liberty rights. And if they don't like, maybe you're a Catholic organization and they just say, I have a bad history with the Catholic Church, I don't want to go to a Catholic place to get this service, that organization would have to give them an alternative. Say, here's a place you can go that's secular where you can get the same service, which just makes sense, right? There's no reason that the federal government should be telling people, oh, we have this taxpayer-funded service, but if you want it, you have to go to this particular religious entity. So these are the sorts of protections that were first put into place by Obama. Trump took them away. Biden put them back. And now by rescinding these orders, Trump is putting them back again. So that's why this should be alarming, even though this is one of those that on the surface I think is really easy to pass over. You just kind of say, oh, this is just normal. But this is restoring a really bad aspect of the first Trump era, where it's a removal of religious liberty protections, particularly for religious minorities, of course, people who are non-religious and people who are not Christian.
Yeah, and as we talked about at the top of the show, a lot of these are removing the barrier between the separation of state and church. We're going to probably see that with the executive order that's going to offer people even more broader religious objections, or that if they want to raise a religious objection about something that is in healthcare or denial of service. That we'll see what happens when the executive order does come out, but I can imagine the way that a lot of the agencies are interpreting executive orders, they're even being more broad than the executive order. So I would imagine the one on religious free speech. Okay, well, if I say, well, I don't like people who have yellow Yeti cups because of Jesus or something, then and I don't feel like providing a service, and that is going to become more protected. So where this matters to you is saying, okay, well, let's say you have a yellow Yeti cup and someone says, well, I think Jesus doesn't like people with yellow Yeti cups, and you want to go through the courts. Well, now you're going to have the federal government, whether it's through various offices of civil rights, which was kind of designed to do the opposite and keeping religion neutral, that you're now going to have the federal government that could support state attorney generals who are doing that. It's going to start directing more resources. So if people want a religious exemption on more aspects of daily life, they're going to be granted them in the next few weeks. We'll see what happens when a lot of those regulations start coming out. But if you want to go to Vegas with the odds that so-called religious speech is going to have a higher priority than pretty much most rights, the odds aren't good.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And that plays into another one of these kind of broad stories that we've been talking about for a long time, which is that if you think back to the first Trump term, the team of Trump, McConnell, and Leonard Leo just packed the federal judiciary, including the U.S. Supreme Court, with people who, among other things, want to redefine religious liberty. And so what we previously would call religious coercion and a violation of the separation of church and state is now being redefined and transformed into saying, actually, the Christians in our society have a right to have religious privilege, and if you don't give them that right, that exceptional ability, then you are violating their religious liberty rights, just like turning everything upside down. But this is what you're talking about, right? That they're going to take these ideas like civil rights protection organizations and say, well, instead of protecting actual civil rights, things like actual religious liberty and people's right to a secular government, instead they're going to say, well, let's make sure that Christians are able to deny care or deny service if they want to, because if you don't do that, that's a violation of religious liberty.
So in this new term, what's more important? Is it the Second Amendment or being able to have a religious exemption? Where does that rank?
Unfortunately, that's, I think, that's the question scholars are going to have to wrestle with, is which one gets the top priority.
I'm not really sure on that one.
All right, so the next executive order we have is related to the first one we talked about. So this is specifically about the military. It's called the Government Prioritizing Military Excellence and Readiness. So this is another just meaningless anti-trans activity that there's just not too much more to say about it. It's based on nonsense. There is no reason to think that trans service members are hurting our military excellence or readiness. There's no studies behind that or anything of the sort. It's just kind of this this demagoguery of demonizing trans people, and of course the other consistent rhetoric has been against DEI, right? So there's blaming everything under the sun on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think this falls into that category.
So military excellence and readiness. So you've read it. Anything in there about Putin?
Not a one.
Nothing about Putin. Anything about like egg prices or anything like
Nope,
that? Nope. No Putin, no egg prices. Wow. Okay, here we go. That's a big prioritization for a multi-billion-dollar agency. No Putin and things like that. That would keep me up at night on that. But apparently, this nonsense is a higher priority, which I will not understand.
Absolutely. So on the screen is our initial response to this when we saw it, just pointing out trans rights are human rights. And reaffirming our stance to defend them as needed. And there's a troubling historical note here too for people who know their history. Like you always should be cautious when you're comparing things to Nazi Germany, but in this case, in recent history, it's like the certain parallels are unavoidable. And here, unfortunately, is one of them, where in Berlin, one of the first transgender clinics was one of the first things that Nazis raided and shut down and ransacked. And so it is kind of troubling. And I've seen some historians and reporters raise this point where it's like this is not necessarily entirely a coincidence. And for anyone who is, I've seen people who are not normally on the pro-fascist and/or Christian nationalist train who are kind of on the fence about this issue, and it's like if that happens to be you, just take a step back and take a fresh look at this, because it really actually is pretty scary.
Yeah.
All right, so the next one we're going to talk about is called Ending Radical Indoctrination in K-12 Schooling. So this is specifically about public schools. And of course, there has been a lot of talk from Trump about dismantling the Department of Education. This comes straight from Project 2025. We've seen a federal bill to that effect. We're expecting an upcoming federal executive order that will try to effectively reach that goal. But with this executive order that was signed immediately, the things to be aware of here, and this will not be news to people who are paying attention during Trump's first term, is it reestablishes what he called the 1776 Commission. So this is a group of people who are going to give ideas on how to promote patriotic education. So promoting curriculum that is basically a revisionist history of the United States, that's kind of the, like the fake Thanksgiving story a lot of us learned in elementary school, where it's, you just kind of whitewash everything, sugarcoat all the bad stuff, and say, oh yeah, Americans have always been wonderful, we've never gotten anything wrong. And it becomes very Orwellian. And this is, of course, a response to attempts to make history more accurate and to bring people up to speed on how our country has made mistakes and we can learn from them. That is, of course, not acceptable to this administration. They say, no, we need a patriotic history, because if you're trying to teach real history, that's indoctrination.
I mean, you've got school-age kids, and a good thing to think about is, okay, it's a little wild sounding, but then again, there's a lot of the practical terms of this is, okay, now these are going to go to the Department of Education. So what does that mean? Could there be money available to school districts who teach this, let's go with interesting view of American history, not accurate, is certainly a part of it. So if you're in Evansville, right? Yep. So Evansville might say, okay, well, you're going to get money for this, but you're not going to get money for that. So those are some of the real things that could start coming out pretty soon of this. So, I mean, on one level, it's a little out there, let's be honest, on this, but it does have a lot of implications for folks in Evansville and a lot of school districts all over the country. And whether you're in a blue state, red state, or purple state, the federal government, one of the things it does is it has a lot of money, and it can start where they can put their imprint on something. And again, this goes back to the idea that the president, not necessarily Congress, not what's in the annual appropriations and budget bills every single year, that's where funding goes, but it's really up to the president to decide those things. And you're going to start seeing more of those debates with, how much discretion does the president have? And if the Trump administration is very clear, they want a lot of discretion.
That's right. And we've seen this play out at the state level in just the way you're describing, where the state Department of Education in places like Texas and Oklahoma will come out with curriculum or standards that infuse this ahistorical Christian-based narrative. And they can't legally force teachers to teach it, but what they can do is they can incentivize them. So they'll tell school districts, if you use this curriculum we're feeding you, we will give you X number of thousands of dollars. And so it's pretty coercive when the state is simultaneously starving schools of funding. It's kind of hard for school districts to turn that down. And a lot of federal funds, like you said, go to certain states in particular where they need that funding desperately. And so if the Department of Education, to the extent it continues to exist and operate, is holding these funds hostage by saying you need to be teaching this ahistorical garbage, a lot of school districts are going to say, well, this is what we need to do, and we'll just kind of weather the storm.
Yeah,
so,
and this is what we've got to do to keep the lights on.
Right.
And it's going to be very, very hard, but hopefully we can have an impact in it.
Absolutely.
And get involved in those when it's time to comment, start commenting.
Yes, and public schools have always been one of FFRF's top priorities. It's always been one of the main battlegrounds of state-church separation, unfortunately, but it makes sense. That's where young, impressionable minds are. So we will be paying very close attention to those executive orders in particular, and our members should as well. So, Mark, we've touched on a couple others, but are there any other executive orders that we could mention again that we'll be watching to come out?
Yeah, I think polishing the Department of Education is certainly going to be one. We already talked about the religious liberty expansion. Now, with the Department of Education, it doesn't mean, okay, tomorrow, lights out at the Department of Education on that. But definitely, you're starting to see this with USAID, our United States Development Arm, which it's one of the largest provider of HIV medications and prevention. So they do a lot of really good work. And so what can they do? Can they send the workforce home? How much of an impact can they have? And I mean, quite frankly, a lot of our school districts rely on money coming out of the Department of Education, but they can start undoing those processes. Now, one of the things that you are seeing is that, again, even if you're every school district, whether, again, blue state, red state, or purple state, and in those areas, guess what? You're getting money from the Department of Education. So some of this is moving into just practical realities. I mean, there's the old saying that wasteful government spending happens in somebody else's state or congressional district,
Right.
but in yours, not so much. So I think some of that is you're just bumping into some of those realities. I wouldn't say that's a great insurance policy against some pretty out there stuff, but I think that is one buffer of that when you get into these practical terms, these practical decisions. Again, doesn't matter who you voted for, but I'll bet you dollars to donuts your school board and your local school depends on money coming from Washington.
Absolutely. And it's important to note that even though the Department of Education is an executive branch entity, it's created by Congress.
Right.
So the president cannot unilaterally just get rid of a congressionally created agency. So he cannot literally abolish the Department of Education, but as you were just describing, he can do a lot to throw wrenches in the machine and make it so that it's not doing anything.
Yeah. And going back to Russ Vaught, director of OMB, who manages a lot of the regulations, he says he wants to put the federal workforce in trauma. You're seeing that. And especially in DC, I know a lot of folks who work at the Department of Education. They are really good and are there in those jobs for the right reasons and are doing a really nice job with public service. And it's just a real shame. And it's awful what's happened to a lot of our friends and neighbors on this who are really there for the right amount of money, and it breaks your heart.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last executive order we already talked about, but before we go to audience questions, is the one that we are expecting to see later today, announced at the prayer breakfast. So we'll see. A lot of it is probably going back to Trump 1, where he's working with Paula White, and again redefining religious liberty, trying to kind of put into the law all of the dreams of Christian privilege throughout these executive agencies. So we'll see exactly what that looks like, but we don't know the specifics of that just yet. So with that,
all right, audience questions.
Yeah, let's see what we've got.
What does our team FFRF have to say?
Okay, we have a few things. So first of all, some good questions I'm seeing here. So Mark, could one kind of basic question, could Trump just declare himself Emperor of America? If he did that, who would stop him? What would happen?
Okay, well, you're our constitutional law scholar, but I'm pretty, now granted it's been a little while, but hereditary titles, that's still in effect, right?
Yes.
Okay, no hereditary titles on that. So that would be a pretty tall order on that. I mean, he's already referred, no, it's not even His Excellency, that's still a no-go. I mean, Trump's put his name on lots of stuff, so in theory, he could do all sorts of stuff, but in the idea he is Emperor of America, he has one, is a total sovereign monarch, would be a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, I think that even the most extreme Trump judicial appointees, because obviously that's the practical answer for that. Congress could stand up to it, there would be immediate lawsuits, and even the most extreme federal judges, you'd have to think would stand up for this. I mean, it's insane to say he might have 1 or 2 votes at the Supreme Court. Maybe there's a couple there who I just would not put anything past them.
Right.
But I don't think he gets to 5 on anything like that.
That would be a tall order. Okay, so going to Vegas with those odds, I think would not be a good bet.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
All right.
So yeah, I think the bigger concern is that he consolidates power in a less explicit way. That's really that's the larger realistic concern.
He already has a plane at his disposal. What more did he want? A big one too.
Yeah.
I mean.
Okay, so Mark, any silver lining to these executive orders?
Yeah.
Is there any good news that anyone can glean from any of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and I always give a lot of 3 cheers to FFRF supporters. So on a lot of the action alerts that we had, especially about Vought, as Russ Vought as Project 2025's enforcer, was one of our most popular action alerts. So you are starting to see people connect the dots on some of this very kind of intricate, not well-known things that can get a little fuzzy. So I'm definitely seeing, and even people who write to us are starting to get in the, okay, we all understand I'm just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill and going from there, but then understanding how the regulatory process comes in. So nice job, FFRF supporters, for getting a good understanding of how this works, because especially when a lot of the rules and regulations come down, if you read them, they're going to be, 1, confusing, 2, done in a way that's like, well, this doesn't sound that bad. So part of our job is to help make that process a little bit easier, but good on FFRF supporters for being more engaged. You're starting to see that. I think more people this week are starting to realize the USAID and what that does, and starting to really think about, I know that sometimes it's just been, let's get rid of X amount of federal spending and things like that. Well, a lot of federal spending has a lot of very good impact for our communities and whatnot. So, and even we were even talking with about Russ Vought on the Hill with different senatorial offices, and we talked about, well, you have this agency in this state that is doing some really cool stuff and preventing hurricanes and weather predictions. And by the way, those are, if your state thrives on seafood, well, it's good to know what the sea is going to look like that day, and all of those things, and how, and those are things our government provides. It's I mean, it's great. I mean, I'm sure there's room for efficiency. You have, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, if there's ways to make government easier, more transparent, that has very, very broad bipartisan support. It's just common sense stuff. And you see those legitimate efforts every single day in DC to maybe make less duplication, make things easier, a little better, make access. That has very broad bipartisan support. I think most Americans would say, yes, that is a good thing. But what you're seeing is not that. You're seeing definitely reduction of public services that we all depend upon. Yesterday, on my flight, I'm very happy there is a very, very robust weather service.
Right. Yeah, well, and it makes sense that there's, it's perhaps, even though it's going to be causing a lot of harm in the meantime, it's maybe a wake-up call for a lot of people when people, hear all this rhetoric about, oh, the government wastes all this money and where are my taxes actually going to? And so when you see those things actually fall away, those services that, for instance, tell you what the weather's going to be or provide disaster relief, that people will remember, okay, actually, this is really important. I do want this to be funded.
Right.
And it'll go back to the spot where any suggestion of things like let's defund FEMA is just going to be political suicide, as it should be, right? Okay, we have a question about checks and balances. We touched on that a little bit, talking about, Congress ought to be providing a check and balance here, but there's a lot of frustration. You were discussing that they're not really stepping up and doing that at the moment. What about states? So this is another good question. What if anything, can states do about all this stuff happening when we have all these harmful executive orders coming down from the federal level? If you were talking to state legislators or executive branches of state governments, what could they do to help out?
I'm going to punt that to you as our state guy.
You got it, absolutely. So I think, there's certain areas, of course, where there's reliance on federal governments and there's limited amounts that states can do. So things like these broader services, when you have FEMA, when you have the weather service, there's no way for states to easily plug that particular gap. You just need to be supporting efforts to fix it. But it's different with things like the Department of Education. So for instance, in our home state of Wisconsin, the state legislature has been just horrendously underfunding our public schools. And so this should be a wake-up call. You cannot rely on federal assistance for the things that you have in the past, because when you have a federal executive branch that is committed to just shutting everything down, as state lawmakers, you need to just step up and say, we need to take care of our citizens ourselves. And so that includes not just schools, but also health and human services, and a whole other array of basic protections that I think states need to figure out how can we provide as best we can for everyone in our state, because you can't rely on the federal government to do it for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
All right. And then we've got one more. I love this question. How do I help people at higher risk from these executive orders? So certainly these executive orders are hitting certain people harder than others. If you are in a privileged state where you are not going to be directly impacted by any of these, what is it that you can do? And some of this stuff, I think you're going to be repeating yourself, but what thoughts do you have on what someone who is in that scenario can do?
Ask that person what they need. That's probably the best thing is what do you need? How can we be helpful? How can I be helpful? If for someone who's going to be on the receiving end of a lot of this bad stuff, what do you need? How you can be helpful? I mean, there's millions of scenarios, there's millions of ways to be helpful on them, but it's, look, have someone being impacted on this, if someone lost their job at a federal agency, and just I've been having some of those conversations with some friends of like, okay, if this happens, what do you need me to do? And let's go do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The other thing that I think of is just from, we even experience this within people in the secular movement, is I think a lot of us are feeling a push of cynicism and just a lot of fatigue, right? We've been at this fight for quite a while now. And so I think you have to take care of your own mental health, your own situation first. But if you are in a spot where you are able to say, I'm tired of fighting this, it's kind of annoying more than it is like I can't do this right now, is in that situation drumming up the energy. Remember that there are people who need you to stand up and fight this fight. And so even though as a community we've been fighting this for a very, very long time, and it's really annoying that we have to deal with all of this yet again. Just drum up the energy if you have the capacity to do it, to fight. If not for yourself, then for your neighbors, because, as you were saying, they may be suffering in ways that you don't even know.
And there is something that is really good that you are starting to see people, especially in DC, in more of the activist and lobbying communities and organizations that we work with, whether it's environment, LGBTQ+, reproductive freedom, things along those lines, or labor. You're seeing people, okay, what part of the puzzle can you take and specialize in and do that? And we've just seen that in DC, just a lot of that, okay, well, where can we spend a lot of our time? Where can we have a helpful voice? And where can we be a good cheerleader on a lot of issues that are important to us? And where can our voice really, really count on that? We've definitely talked about it a lot today, but on the Russ Vought nomination, I knew that, you got a lot of good organizations who are going to be really leading the charge on a lot of different nominees. Well, how can we be good and support those? And how can we do that so we can spend more time on Vought? And so that's been a lot of keys to success, is understanding of like, look, we cannot play whack-a-mole. That's not going to work. But if we do a nice job and we can really focus and we can lead in certain areas, then by all means, let's go do that.
Absolutely, well said. Well, Mark, thank you for visiting us in Madison,
it's great to be here.
Hosting in person.
Oh, yeah.
And with that, that wraps up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. A new episode of our broadcast TV show Free Thought Matters airs this weekend. FFRF co-presidents Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker will show how Trump's new administration is already rolling out the red carpet for Christian nationalism. You'll be able to watch that episode on TV stations around the country this weekend, and it's already on the FFRF YouTube channel right now.
And don't miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio, or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out at we-dissent.org.
We also have a lot of fun and irreverent merch available on our online store. There's t-shirts, bumper stickers, pins, coffee mugs, books, and so much more. You can check all that out by visiting ffrf.org/shop. And finally, if you want more information about the Freedom From Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you so much. If not, please join us. See you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.